Without further ado, so again, as I mentioned, my name is Alexandra Maloney. I'm a BPIA board member and the moderator for today. We're really excited to speak to our host, to speak to our guests, to speak with our guest speaker, Lieutenant Rachel Thomas. The thoughts and views of our guest speakers are their own. And if you haven't already, please follow Black Professionals in International Affairs on social media. And lastly, we encourage viewers to chime in through the chat with any comments or questions that they may have that I'm happy to incorporate into this interview as we speak to Ms. Thomas. So without further ado, I will introduce our guest speaker. Lieutenant Rachel Thomas is an active duty foreign area officer in the U.S. Navy, detailed to the Department of State as the senior military advisor on women, peace, and security. She works to enhance the Department of Defense's and State Department cooperation and collaboration on policies focused on the advancement of WPS, women, peace, and security, and further the civilian and military partnerships within bilateral and multilateral spheres. She advises on opportunities between the Department of Defense and the State Department, as well as other partner militaries on gender training and gender-related engagement. She also contributes to policy and programmatic development based on the connection between the security of women and girls and national security. So prior to her detail at State, she worked on improving relationships between partner militaries within the Indo-Asia-Pacific region, specifically on areas of military exercises. A native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, Rachel holds a BS in history and a minor in Japanese from the U.S. Naval Academy, as well as an MA in international relations from Salve Regina University. So thank you, Rachel, so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll apologize for any sort of like little beeps and things in the background as we kind of learn to, well, for me, learn to mute and unmute my different tabs that I have on my computer. But no, thank you so much, Alexandria, for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So I'd like to start off by asking, so you have a wealth of experiences for your relatively young age. So could you tell us a little more about your professional journey and maybe some about your academic journey as well?
Sure. So something that I like to talk about is my family, especially my dad, was very much put education at the top of everything. So for him and his family growing up in the ghetto in Detroit, Michigan, education was basically the only way out of the ghetto at that point. Just due to, I think he had 7 brothers and sisters, not a lot of money, so that was going to be the way out. So from there and through experiences that we took as a family traveling, and he prioritized us learning and understanding, led to me going to the Naval Academy. So my brother went first. He wanted to fly jets, and he wanted to go to the Air Force Academy, but my father basically said, well, you know, actually Navy flies more, which is true. Don't let anyone, especially from the Air Force, tell you differently. But with that, I followed sort of in his footsteps. And I was supposed to originally become a naval flight officer. So I was ready to go aviation. I was ready to go through flight school, and I was prepared for that. However, a couple weeks before graduation, I was told that my eyesight wasn't good enough. So I ended up having to completely shift my focus and shift my career. And within about a week and a half, they asked me, well, now you have to choose. Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? You can choose. You can look at the Marine Corps. You can look maybe at submarines. You can look at surface warfare. And so, like you said in my bio, I minored in Japanese, and Japan had always been such a really interesting sort of place that I'd love to experience. So I took the leap and basically said, why not? This is something that I might not be able to do later on in life. I might as well just take that jump and go into a completely different area. So I chose what's called a destroyer out of Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan. And a lot of that was on the job training. So you get a little bit of prior knowledge on what ships, sort of what you're supposed to be doing in your daily life, but a lot of times it's like drinking from a fire hose. They set you in there, you have the first day on the job, you have no clue what you're doing, and then good luck, have fun. So for me, although I have a bachelor's of science, because the Naval Academy, that's how it's set up, my focus was history and Japanese. So when I got to the ship and they assigned me 2 engineering billets, I was a little bit out of where I thought I was going to be for my comfort zone. But that's a lot of where me taking those steps is a lot of where I gained some of the leadership styles that I use now, through a lot of trial and error, but also through being able to work with the people that I did. I'd never really had much leadership experience, never really, had always stayed within my comfort zone of security, of thinking that maybe I wasn't always going to be the best at something, thinking I was just an average person, kind of putting myself down with self-esteem wise. But when I was put in charge of these different divisions and groups of people, I realized that I could no longer, there we go, could no longer be that person. And so being thrust into those leadership roles and understanding that I was now the one that people looked to be in charge of these people who themselves ranged from age 19 to age 35. So these 35-year-olds who had 10, 15, 20 years in the Navy had to listen to me, who had maybe a month in. And understanding all of that gave such a weight of responsibility that it was terrifying, but also it was empowering. And then, like I said, trial and error through all of that, I was able to sort of shape what I wanted to do and shape my experiences. So that after about 5 years in Japan, when I came back to the States, I worked in the Pentagon for about 1.5 years, another completely new experience, because the Navy likes to take you maybe 2 or so years at a time, say, you think you have it? You think you're an expert now? Next job. So then you do basically the same sort of cycle all over again, and you learn through it. But that also makes you adaptable, and it makes you easier to take challenges as they come, and quicker to be able to think on your feet. So I worked for the Pentagon on what's going to be the new guided missile frigate. It is a new class of ship, so hopefully in the next 2 years it will come out. But I had to learn about acquisitions and more engineering and understand that system as well. And with that, we moved more into the bureaucratics. So DoD, Department of Defense, and the operational side of the military is a little bit different from the sort of policy bureaucratic side of the military. And those are 2 things that not necessarily always work together, but that I had to learn to understand how they worked. So through that, after all of that military experience, I applied and was picked up for what's called a foreign area officer. And that is my current job. So I am an Indo-Asia-Pacific foreign area officer, and we're basically, like State Department has foreign service officers, we are the Navy's diplomats. We're meant to understand the cultures, societies, politics of the regions that we're in charge of, as well as the language, and be able to advise partner militaries, partner governments, help training exercises between US military and between their government and their militaries. And so my first job is here at the State Department as a military advisor for women, peace, and security, which in another turn of events, women, peace, and security is not necessarily what you'd think of military or of something that the DoD would be doing. And to be honest, I hadn't heard of it before starting this job, which shows a little bit of where DoD needs to get to in women, peace, and security.
Yeah, because even now in, 2019 and 2020, I'm still meeting women who are like, yes, I'm the first advisor on women, peace, and security for my organization or for my agency. But I acknowledge and appreciate that the step is even being taken. That's the first part. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see a few folks have joined in. As we've begun, we're here with Lieutenant Rachel Thomas, who is a senior military advisor on detail with the State Department and is a foreign areas officer for the U.S. Navy. So we're really excited to speak to her. For folks who are here, go ahead and drop in the chat if you're here with WCAPS, drop a hashtag WCAPS in the chat. And if you're here with BPIA, feel free to put a hashtag BPIA in the chat box area. And also feel free to put any questions that you may have for Rachel as we continue the conversation. So connecting on the points that you made about your journey through this up to this point, can you tell us more about what the work is that you do now, and specifically on the topic of military and civilian partnerships? What does that look like in the work that you do? And where do you see kind of some of the opportunity areas and the gap areas for women, peace, and security in this partnership space?
Sure. So a lot of what I do that there's quite a few facets of women, peace, and security. But like you said, what I do is a lot of civilian military partnerships. I liaison with DoD and State, a lot with engaging partner militaries. I also do work on peacekeeping with the United Nations Security Council, resolutions and mandates, countering violent extremism. And so as you can tell, a lot of that has to do with the security part of it. We do a little bit of work with gender-based violence as well, since that's basically a cross-cutting issue in all of society and all of women's empowerment. And from experience, some of the gaps that I've seen in working between civilian and military counterparts is sort of a lack of partnership as well as communication sometimes. For example, I was at a training with USAID, so the U.S. Agency for International Development, and during one of the meetings, one of the guys was sort of complaining to me just on the side, saying, like, I'm stationed at whatever embassy, and I never know like what the military is doing. I don't get it. Like they're talking, and they always end up sort of announcing things or whatever. And so I asked him, well, are you talking to the military counterparts? Where are they stationed? Well, I mean, they're at the same embassy. And so, well, left hand, meet right hand. And so when that happens, we end up doing parallel lines of effort and parallel work that at the very best sort of coincides and you get some great things out of it. But at the worst, can accidentally contradict one or the other. And then that shows that we might not be as united of a front. We might not be on the same page. So that's something that I try and always talk about, is communication is key. You need to be able to make sure that everyone is communicating within the interagency. So across all of the government departments and agencies, but especially between civilians and military.
Right.
Another one, actually, I think in that same sort of meeting, is the language barrier. And the language barrier, right? We're all speaking English, but we're really not all speaking the same English. There's different slang in the military. There's different things. So, for example, when we at State talk about targets, and we talk about target audiences or things like that, we mean a little bit different things than what Department of Defense is when they talk about targets.
Right.
And so understanding the lingo between the two is pretty important, especially when I've worked together with the interagency and we put a sentence in there about interventions. And interventions mean something very different to the military. And so then you have people who are getting, excuse the pun, up in arms about these different wordings, and their feathers are getting ruffled. And then you stop and you talk to them and you realize that they're actually saying the same thing, but they're just not understanding like where that connection is. So it's really interesting that they're trying to reach the same goal, but they're just completely missing each other. And then the other thing is lack of representation. So this is something that has to do with civilian military partnerships, but overall in the militaries and the governments just is an issue writ large. this is something that's internal and external. It's no surprise that DoD and the government lack women, especially women of color. And it's all over all levels of government. And what that ends up doing is it ends up hurting our reputation abroad. And I'm sure a lot of people in this discussion are nodding their heads and understanding that when we go to countries, when we go to partner militaries, and we talk about the importance of increasing women's participation, women's meaningful participation, it's the right thing to do, it's a smart thing to do, yet we sent a delegation of all white older men, our words are not meeting our actions. And so with that, we're trying to make sure that when we do these engagements, like there are so many opportunities. So for the lighter side, there are so many opportunities between civilian and military partnerships, which include integrating state foreign policy into military exercises, because that's going to make the exercise much more comprehensive, and it's going to make it so much better for the society that we're trying to train and teach. But that representation is always going to be at the back of their minds, and that's something that they're not afraid to call out. So as the United States, we do have a tendency, and I mean everyone can tell, we do have a tendency to always have our talking points be we are leaders in whatever it is. You can put we are leaders in industry, economics, pandemic response, all of this stuff, when we don't necessarily take a look internally at ourselves and understand the problem areas and understand the gaps. And so that's something that when I do my job and I get called out on certain things, like, oh, well, the last delegation that came to us, to our military was all white, or the last delegation was all men talking about women. You have to acknowledge it, number one. But number two, we're all in this together. So we are on that same uphill battle to get women and representation in all parts of our government, and we would like to bring them along with us. So I know I'm a little bit off topic, but that's something that we should always be doing, is acknowledging our gaps and acknowledging that there are things that we have in common, but not to come in as, here, let me tell you how to do your job, because I obviously know everything that is to know about your culture.
And I'm going to ask, because we have some questions coming in. Thank you for those who have submitted and continue to ask away. One from a Samantha Turner, hey Samantha, who asks if, Rachel, if you could comment on perspectives on whiteness in the women, peace, and security community, which is predominantly staffed by white women. In your opinion, has it affected the movement, or is there a potential risk to the agenda in terms of inclusion?
Yeah.
Very good question. Thank you.
It is. It's a snaps for Samantha. Especially because it's the same sort of thing as having the white men in the room talk about representation and talk about diversity. White women, like, I'm not general. I want to make sure that I'm saying I am not generalizing. I do not mean to generalize, and this is from my own experience. So this is me speaking, but a lot of times I have seen that people want to be allies and people want to be advocates, but they're kind of missing the mark on how advocacy actually works. So when we want to make sure that we're talking about people coming from privilege, being an advocate doesn't necessarily mean you speak out on the issue. It means that you bring someone into the fold who can speak out on the issue. So you bring women and minorities to the table that never would have gotten there. So you should use your own influence and your position of power to bring in those who don't have that foot in the door. And a lot of it is subconscious. A lot of people don't realize it when, like, I come from a place of privilege. So like I would hope, and I hope someone would call me out if I ever came in and tried to speak about the effect of the systematic inequality and racism and poverty without having brought someone in who was actually experiencing that.
Yeah.
So I think that's just something in women, peace, and security in a lot of these amazing movements and amazing organizations that we have, is just to be very cognizant of the fact that we don't know everything, but there's someone out there that will be able to provide that perspective that we've been missing.
Thank you for sharing that. And my next question, you're leading right into it with that response. So according to this recent report that I read from UN Women that was on peace and security, I'm sure this is not a big shocker, but in short, the report, pointed to women that have continuously been largely excluded from, negotiations in negotiating peace in these spaces. So like, this may be a big question, but, in your opinion, Rachel, how can women have a seat at the table in some of these rooms that may be, white dominated or male dominated? Have there been times that you have faced any, imposter syndrome, being the only woman or the only woman of color in the room? And how did you overcome that feeling and be able to step in as a confident person to say, I'm here and my point is valid and here's why?
So I'm glad that you bring up the imposter syndrome. That's something that I think a lot of us feel, but we don't acknowledge or we don't name as such. Even going through my professional background, even when I was writing my LinkedIn stuff and things like that, when I write my resume, I think sometimes I used to think to myself, like, wow, like I've been lucky, or like, wow, like I had the right doors open for me, or I can't believe that I'm able to put some of these things on my resume. And I've actually had to bounce things off of some of my friends and say, like, well, I wouldn't call myself an expert, which luckily for me, I have some good friends that sort of snap me out of it and said, that's BS. That's complete BS. You have this and this. But the fact that we have those issues where we internalize and we beat ourselves down with sort of those self-esteem issues. I'm actually reminded of a quote from Michelle Obama. Right, I think I have it. I've been at probably every powerful table that you can think of. I have worked at nonprofits. I have been at foundations. I've worked in corporations, served on corporate boards. I've been at G summits, and I've sat at the UN. They're not that smart. And I think that quote really resonates because we put these people up on pedestals, and we think they are the best of the best. They are the experts. No one can compare to them. But that's not true a lot of the times. A lot of the times they took that opportunity, they applied for the job that they were underqualified for. They just went for it. And then they sort of faked it till they made it. And now they're up where they are. So for example, that I have people reaching out to me to do discussions, and I look around. Like,
Who, me?
I just started this a year ago. You sure? But and so it's hard. It's still hard. And I've seen women and women of color who are at these top levels saying like, wow, like I don't know how I got here. I'm not the smartest one in the room. And it's sad to see. But at the same time, now that I'm in a job where we work a lot with vulnerable populations, with women and women peace builders and women who are fighting for change and fighting for in conflict affected areas. And I start to see like they're not what you'd consider experts. Like they're not the ones who graduated with 5 degrees. They're not the ones who have been at all of these different tables and things, but they understand the problem set uniquely because of where they've been in their experience, and they have that perspective. And I realized that I may not have been born in a conflict zone. Like I haven't had some of those issues, but also being a queer biracial woman in the military offers some insight that a group of white men, while they may hear it, they haven't experienced it. And that's not to say that any race, well, that's not to say that the people that I'm talking about, when I talk about old white men, I'm not putting people in this all white men sort of thing. That's just unfortunately the face of a lot of these government areas, just due to some other systemic inequalities that have sort of been prevalent. But all of those experiences are warranted. All of those experiences, perspectives, when brought together, make for a much more comprehensive solution in whatever we're looking at. And so I realized when I started to think of it that way, that I am helping to participate in solutions, and that I am valid, and that I'm supposed to be there. So when I was in Japan, I was selected to become an anti-submarine warfare tactics instructor, or a WTI. And we are the subject matter experts for anything under the sea, submarines, things like that. And because of that designation, I had the ability to go to admirals and to generals and basically tell them, based on my experience, this is what we need to do. And because I had that designation, they listened. If they wanted to fight back, they could, but in the end, my perspective and my recommendation won out because I had that. And I just kind of remember. And so that also helped me to understand that just because I might be a lower ranking person, which unfortunately in the military, we talk about wanting to see things with a fresh set of eyes, but then when someone new comes in and actually sees it with a fresh set of eyes and tries to give recommendations, they're usually shot down, in my experience. But even though I was a lower rank, they had to listen because I brought in a certain perspective and certain expertise that they didn't have and they weren't trained to. So that also helped me to realize that it doesn't matter what your rank is. It doesn't matter your expertise level, like if you've had that experience, or maybe your formal education. Formal education is great. It might help you to learn how to advocate better. It might help you to find some of the words that will make this translate from your experience into a policy or whatever. But your lack of experience and formal education like that, it does not invalidate what you have lived through, and it does not invalidate your perspective and the influence and importance that you bring to the table.
We have one question here that is a follow-up to this topic on imposter syndrome from a Trazen, who says, relating to imposter syndrome and the people that we put on pedestals, could you relate that to some of the problems within the civilian military divide? I regularly see it happen, that civilians are sometimes unwilling to contradict military counterparts and will frequently defer to military judgment on a topic.
That's a great question. I think we have this sort of idea that has been permeating at least through US thought processes and how we see people. And yeah, we tend to put military up on a pedestal. Like, they can do no wrong. Any wrongs that are brought against them are false, or one bad apple in the bushel. And obviously not to say that military people are inherently bad, because that would be weird for me. But the support our troops sort of mentality, the very patriotism, it's great, but it does tend to set aside and set apart the military population from the rest of the civilian population. So in terms of when we talk about civilian military relationships, and we talk about, it really depends on what the context is. Are we talking about a mainly military exercise? Are we talking about a civilian exercise where we're bringing in military advice, which would be sort of what I'm doing right now? And I've seen that. People have deferred to me on everything military, which is, I mean, I'm Navy, but people ask me questions about the Army and the Air Force, and I was like, slow your roll. Let me find someone that I know that I cannot answer this question, but someone else can. But they sort of get you into this monolith of you're in the military, you know everything the military does, which not true. I'm not going to go to someone on the street and be like, you're a civilian, you must know what our foreign policy is. It's sort of the same thing. And we need to, especially in the military, we have this really bad habit of kind of looking at civilians being like, oh, okay, like they're a civilian, like they kind of know what they're talking about, but anything military related is our lane. And we have that divide of swim lanes. And whenever someone starts to like swim into that other lane, they get cut out again. And I've seen this at tables where they ask the civilian for expertise and whatever, they ask for advice, and the civilian, who is the expert at whatever it is, gives their advice. But in the back of the mind, the military is kind of like, cool. Yeah.
Thanks for your perspective, and then continues on with the conversation.
Exactly. You could propose a course of action, a COA, COA 2, which is a lot more comprehensive, but it means the military takes a back seat, and the military sometimes doesn't have that tendency to be able to do that. And so they're like, cool, we'll go with COA 1, which the military has to lead. And something that I try to do is highlight what everyone brings to the table. The civilian brings expertise of that topic because they're not in that expert position for nothing. Like they're not a policy advisor for nothing. They're not a senior advisor for nothing. They have those. And they have the expertise that when we bring that into the military aspects and we bring it into asking what the civilian population, what's going to happen if we do this exercise, what's going to happen if we do this tactic, and for them to come in with those sociocultural understandings and say, well, this is what's going to happen, how can we mitigate that and make it better, and here's my recommendation.
Great, thank you for answering that. You are such a rock star, Rachel. I'm in awe, because I can imagine like what, this is going to be kind of an impromptu question, but in terms, when you meet individuals or men, for example, how do you, what strategies do you have to combat any resistance that you may find or see, or folks who are like, oh, this women stuff again? How do you interact with those individuals?
Just right out, it's hard. It's definitely hard because you're so, like, I'm so into this stuff now and understanding, educating, that it's very difficult to put yourself sometimes on the other side where they have that bias already. And it's women as well. Women have this weird bias, like this benevolent, if you want to look up the term benevolent sexism, it's a really interesting sort of thing. There's been some articles on it where they paint women as always as the caretakers, as the mothers who want to protect their family, as the peace build, like, which is great, or as victims, which is, I mean, not discounting those, but also women can be combatants, women are fighters, women are all of these things. But we could dangerously put them as a monolith. Anyway, that was a side note, but I've talked to people about when I say women, peace, and security, when I say gender, I've had run the gamut of like people asking, oh, you mean you're talking about transgender? Which you're just, it's like, no, my friend, no. But it's easy, it's better if you understand kind of where they're coming from. Like if there's someone who is coming from where they've never heard the difference between sex and gender, they've never heard the difference of what women, peace, and security is, it's different in how you engage versus someone who's kind of heard of the issue. So what I found helps a lot, both in state and DoD, is to understand their part in women, peace, and security. So some colleagues and I ran this example, really my colleagues ran this example on trying to find where women, peace, and security fit into almost every bureau of the State Department. Wow. So women, peace, and security, putting in women into ISN, international security and negotiations, or into AVC, arms control and verification, where a lot of people, when we reach out, they're like, I don't understand. Like, what does this have to do with me at all? And so it's finding those connections, because usually once they found those connections and they have that aha moment, then they start to understand and they start to learn more. And something that actually Samantha Turner and I like to use is that in the military, it saves time, money, and lives. And so when you put it, especially for DoD, when you're very clear and concise, and when you put it in that aspect, they start to think more, right? If you come up to someone who deals in strategics and tactics, and you ask them, all right, like imagine you're on a battlefield and your men and women are out there. Would you go into battle if you only had 50% of the information? And most people are, well, no, I want all the information. Like, great. Include women. Like, women are 50% of most of the populations that we are going to be engaging with. You can't discount 50% of the perspectives and of the evidence that you have. So it's just understanding where they're coming from, what their position is, and tailoring it to that. Because sometimes, and not always, but sometimes they'll have these aha moments where someone who used to speak so negatively about women, peace, and security, and they're taking their money, or they're always there in the room, like, I don't understand asking about women. Sometimes when they have that aha moment, they become supporters and they become advocates. And unfortunately, the white men who become advocates, it's great because they're listened to. And so women and others who have been shouting it from the rooftops and from the rafters, all of that work is overshadowed by one of these national security guys being like, I think women are important. And everyone's supposed to clap for them and sort of cheer them on. And so it's frustrating. But right now, that's where we are in terms of trying to get this into the national security arena.
Thank you for that. We have one question here from Michelle, who asks, Rachel, have you found one country in particular that is making significant strides in women, peace, and security issues? So I know for me, when I kind of reflect on this as a very civilian person, I'll say, what comes to mind for me is maybe like the Israeli women's forces or things like that, where there's an emphasis and an existence, I think, around women, peace, and security issues. So I'm curious, Rachel, to know what your opinion on, or maybe it's not one country in particular, but some really positive steps that you've seen or have encountered with governments or militaries in taking the right steps in women, peace, and security.
Yeah, sure. So you bring up Israel, which is good. They were actually the first country with domestic legislation that spoke about women's meaningful participation, especially within the security sector. One that I can think of from the global north would be Canada. So Canada, right, it's when I say Canada, people are like, well, of course, Canada, like it's one of the richer countries, it's a Western country sort of thing. But also they have understood that there are issues within their own military that they need to address. There are issues within the indigenous population that they're kind of being forced to address now, because more people are calling out the issue where indigenous women from the First Nations are disappearing, and there's a lot of gender-based violence that are happening. And so the outcry has started to increase to a point where the government is taking more notice. Within Canadian military, same sort of thing, where they're understanding that the lack of representation is hindering their response to disaster and recovery and their effectiveness operationally. One that I can think of down in this Kenya, I would say, is a good example. Kenya's become a lot more invested in women, peace, and security. We get a lot of different suggestions from the Kenyan embassies and things of what they can do for women, peace, and security. And especially within the military. It's really cool to see some of those things. And then in the Middle East, Jordan is actually on its way. We have trained a couple of Jordanian female pilots at, I believe, the Air National Guard, but I would have to be checked on that. But now Jordan is training their own female pilots, and they're taking that step. So around the world, oh, and one more. So this is not necessarily a country, but ASEAN. I'm not even going to try and do that. The Asian Society, or Association for Southeast Asian Nations. There we go. Yep. We're starting to see more women, peace, and security language in a lot of their leader statements and their summits that we hadn't seen before. And part of that does have to do with the fact that the United States and other people who are seen as leaders, and they're putting their political will out there, and they're understanding that their influence actually does influence other countries. So when we talk a lot about women, peace, and security and the importance of women, other countries listen. Their ambassadors have understood that. And so I forget what country it was, but there's a story where the ambassador would talk to the governors and to the Congress people, not Congress, but the parliamentarians. Mm-hmm. And they would always leave, their male counterparts would always leave the female or the women out. Mm-hmm. And so the ambassador saw that, and what he started to do was speak to the women legislators, and only speak to them. And then when he had meetings with their male counterparts, he'd be like, "Oh, did you hear about what your colleague proposed, or did you hear whatever? I had a great conversation with her. Like, she's really on top of this." And that started to change the perspectives and the minds of everyone that like within that thing, saying like, wow, like they really understand, or he's really respecting these women and just putting them in the same positions. Like, maybe we should as well.
Thank you for sharing that. We had a question here from, I want to make sure that I read it off correctly, from Cheryl Voisart, who says, "Great presentation, Rachel. Can you talk about the role of mentorship during your journey in the military? And also, if you could speak on maybe how do you identify a mentor, and how do you make that connection?"
Mm-hmm. So mentorship is, number one, it's crucial. It's really important to find mentors, especially within the military. It's hard though, because there are great mentors who didn't come from the same backgrounds or experiences, but it's really nice to have someone who kind of understands a little bit, who understands like any sort of discrimination aspect, who understands the environment in which you may have grown up. And so actually within the Navy, we have a group called Female Navy Officers, and cool. it's a Facebook, so it's a social media forum, but we discuss different issues and different concerns and problems, and we discuss the topic of mentorship. And so we actually have a mentorship sort of spreadsheet, like if you're looking for a mentor that they can match you, because we still aren't at that point with representation, that there are so many, that there are not enough women leaders within the military, at least for me on ships. I had, I think, one department head, so someone who's above me on the ship, that was a woman. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a woman or have to be a minority, but it's just something that you already have sort of that bond of some shared experiences. So what I've been trying to do is fulfill that role for others, because I understand how important it is when you're sort of out there thrust into the job on your own, like I was on my first ship, and not having anyone to ask questions to, or not having anyone to tell you that it does get better, which is something that we have an issue with retention, sorry. Mm-hmm. When you don't see representation up at the top, you get a little bit downtrodden, saying, why isn't there representation? Is it so bad that I'm going to want to leave? And so I don't say that the onus is on those people who have been those trailblazers, because they've already trailblazed so much already. But if they have the time to reach out to someone, just answer a couple of questions, engage with them, And I think that's something that's extremely important.
I see folks have got some great questions in here. And unfortunately we have to wrap, but I'll go ahead and take one more question here. Or maybe Rachel, I feel, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know which one to choose. But one question talks about, can you talk about best practices for using surrogates as spokespeople for a cause like women, peace, and security, or diversity in the military? So maybe you can touch a little bit on that. And then one other person is asking, she's interested in learning more about how you addressed integration of these gender perspectives within military planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can probably try and talk about both.
And they're pretty recent. One is from Samantha Turner, and one is the latest one from Carolyn.
So for using surrogates as spokespeople, right? We talk about allowing people to get into the door, or get their foot in the door, and people at the table. But I think in the military that's hard, because you would basically have to make sure that they're in the military and that they're at a point where you can get that. However, I think that finding, maybe through doing focus groups, doing things like that, finding the people who this really applies to. So if I'm trying to look for the impact of the lack of LGBT or the lack of diversity in the military, and why that is, I would probably try and find people who I know are part of those communities. And I would come to them and say, I have an opportunity to be your spokesperson. Like, I know that I'm sorry that you can't be at the table, but I want to know from you, what are your issues? What are you seeing that those are the problems? And I know some places do it. So DACOITS, which is the Defense Department's Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, actually has a great report that they put out, and it discusses a lot of recommendations that they've gotten from focus groups. Those focus groups compile of men and women. They also compile of quotes and different things to sort of help them explain in their own voice the issue. So I think that's something that's important. And then to Carolyn's question on integration of a gender perspective in the military planning, I have talked a lot about women and participation of women and women's inclusion, but gender perspectives go above and beyond that. So gender, when we talk about gender, we're talking about the roles that a society will place on men and women in terms of the cultural context, the religious context, things like that. So getting a gender perspective is understanding what men and women are expected to do in that society. Doing a gender analysis and integrating all those perspectives means that we're just taking something and we are understanding the sort of impact that those roles have on our military operations. So for example, one of them is when we started the war in Afghanistan, and the military came in and they looked and saw that there was no well in the village. And so perfect opportunity to do some great work, public diplomacy. Let's build a well. So they built a well in the center of the village. And that night it got destroyed. So like, weird. So they built the well again, got destroyed again. They kept building it, and they thought that the terrorists, they thought that someone was tearing it down as an affront to the US military and all of these things. And then one day, some of the members were talking to some of the women of the village. And through just all of these different events, it turns out that the women of the village were the ones tearing the well down. And that was because every day when they went to go take water, they would have to walk a mile, 2 miles to get it. But that was their time to connect. And that was their time to speak with each other. And that was their time to catch up, because they were expected to stay at home and they were expected to take care of their kids and not really have that much time for interaction. Another thing of a gender analysis is in Iraq, when we started setting up checkpoints between certain border areas, and there were bombings, there were suicide bombings. And so when we first started, there were male service members who were searching the women, which is extremely against the culture. It's an affront. You cannot touch their women. So they started to just not search them, which increased bombings, increased other mishaps, because then the terrorists realized that they could get away with that. So, and they could get away with a man dressing up as a woman and not getting touched. So the next thing, they're like, okay, well, let's put in women also to be able to search those who come through, and understanding that that barrier goes away when it's woman searching a woman. So they were able to do that really quick, dirty gender analysis, realize what the problems were, and aim to fix it. So when we do that, especially, and I know we're like running out of time, but especially in like humanitarian and disaster recovery and response, and even now within the COVID crisis, how we do our logistics and how we do things, civilian or military, we have to take into account that culture. Women in here are actually around the world, I believe, 75% of healthcare workers and unpaid work is done by women. When we talk about logistics, when we talk about them in a crisis, say a tsunami, are we taking account into the fact, are we taking into account the fact that a lot of the women can't swim, and a lot of the women were killed in the tsunami because of the gender bias against them being able to swim? Or were they at home, were their husbands out fishing, so they've died, and so now when we bring in these 50-pound bags of rice to feed their families, can the women actually take that rice home? Can they carry it home the 5 miles they need to from the logistics, the distribution center? Can they take that time out of their day when they're supposed to be caring for their children, when they're supposed to be cooking dinner? Because if they do, and then their husband comes home, gets angry because they haven't taken care of the house and beats them, now you have an increase of gender-based violence, there's no food, and so on and on. So things happen. So that's when we look at anything that we're integrating into the military, when we do exercises, we have to understand how it affects the needs of men, women, boys, and girls, understanding that women are disproportionately affected, women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict and crisis, and do not even just, right, gender blind is where we have everything's gender neutral, and you have those people who say, I don't see gender, or I don't see, that's not okay. But then you also have gender sensitive and gender responsive. And so everything that we need to do needs to be gender responsive, which just means that we acknowledge the differences in what everyone needs, and we respond to that as such. We make the bags of rice smaller. We make the time to distribute at the time when they have free time, when they're not supposed to be cooking dinner or anything else, so that they can feed their families.
Rachel, thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge with us. For folks who have joined in, thank you so much for attending and listening in. This is a part of our leadership series. So Rachel spoke on military and civilian partnerships today, women, peace, and security. We have more great speakers coming up, so please feel free to visit our website. On Friday, we have Colonel Sarah V. Simmons, who's speaking on the integration of women in the defense forces in Botswana. She was a colonel with the U.S. Army. She's now retired. So please feel free to check our website for more information on that. I'm seeing some go Army, go Air Force, go Navy.
Go Navy, beat Army. I mean, in Air Force too. You guys are great.
Well, thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much, Alexandria.
All right, thanks.
Bye.